1. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, the only thing certain is uncertainty, and that uncertainty is precisely what motivates our side of the House. Towards the latter end of their speech, the previous speaker talked about a free market. We think that contradicts the previous part of her speech because we think a feature of economic liberalism in itself is a free market, like what I told you in my POI. It is precisely because of things like corruption and the capacity of these singular state-controlled entities that inhibit the ability of the IMF and the World Bank to actually take a stance. And in status quo under their side, it's exactly where they genuflect and cater only to China, only to America, and these rich, singular institutions who we think have failed society, proving the need for economic liberalism precisely because of globalization. Economic liberalism serves as an incentive structure to become a check and balance against a singular point of failure, which is the state or a singular country. Over the past 50 years, because of the advent of globalization, we think that economic liberalism, principally and pragmatically, is the most compatible and most efficient school of thought and economic ideology that seeks to be able to empower developing countries and take the urban poor on average out of their own poor circumstances. A couple of features of opposition model to be very clear. Number one, this is a value judgment debate about how exactly this particular economic liberalism is going to play out for major financial institutions. It isn't about whether status quo is good or bad, or whether in a vacuum economic liberalism is good or bad. The point in which states and economies fail is precisely at the point in which you have an over-concentration of power on the US and China, and that's where economic liberalism kicks in and makes us cognizant or aware of that reality and that locus of control. Meaning, we're already feeling the effects of pegging all of our currencies and transactions on the US dollar, and we particularly believe that's exactly the point in which we create a sense of alternatives. That is to say, a couple of things which economic liberalism uniquely does, even if we're over-reliant. A, it spurs growth, and growth in and of itself is something good, because we recognize the divide between developed countries and developing countries. But the unique factor is that to do things like manufacturing and production is so expensive and difficult for particular poorer nations. Meaning, we need to be able to trade and be a partner with larger states in order to get economies of scale, to be able to do things like get quality of materials, to be able to get specific things like commodities, for instance, instead of having to forge and mine that on our own, which we recognize on the comparative is going to be more expensive. B, this just increases the quality of life of people all around the world, precisely in my POI, the point in which you create plurality and a sense of being able to choose when you have more trade partners and be able to choose from. What is the tie back to the World Bank and the IMF? Because that's an important part of the nuance the previous speaker had missed. The nuance is that these institutions no longer become whitewashed, and you create an incentive structure for them to give a shit about the poor man. You give them an incentive structure to care about Southeast Asia, Latin America, and other parts of Africa, which we do understand are not as developed countries. The next thing here is that a push on their side that absent economic liberalism, contrary to popular belief, things can get worse. Yes, globalization and capitalism is not perfect, but on our side, we have a plurality of choice to be able to get out of that, wherein we create a sense of competition and innovation. What is the argument, as I've also been arguing in my pre-oration? Argument is very simple. The features of economic liberalism that actually spur growth, even if at worst there is an over-reliance, we tell you that absent that, things can get worse, and I'm going to analyze the biggest harms of economic liberalism, taking their case at their best, and why the features of economic liberalism in and of itself because of capitalism, meritocracy, and the invisible hand, are self-correcting that allow us to deal with the biggest harms that their side is going to push on us. The first layer of analysis here is that limited government control and the privatization of state-owned enterprises, especially if they characterize them to be corrupt, to be malevolent, or to be nefarious, is exactly at the point in which we have alternatives. We think that through economic liberalism, developed countries are now able to create systems of healthcare and education that are boosted by the private sector that actually make it cheaper. Absent that, if we're solely reliant on that corrupt state to be able to create these privately run enterprises and organizations, that is the point in which there's so much risk. Meaning, it's because of that uncertainty and the reasons Prime Minister characterized that we're not willing to take that risk, and we rather outsource those things from people to be able to help us create those institutions. Number two, we think that the IMF and the World Bank promote a more equitable redistribution of wealth as opposed to a particular single country ruling those shots, because they're able to do things like structural adjustment programs and policy recommendations at a point in which one country is so overpowered and a point in which there's so much systemic risk there. We're able to buff up some other nations wherein we're able to spur innovation and competition when we lower tariffs and lower quotas and allow them to be able to grow their import and export market, wherein we just create more trade and more markets which are in the spirit of globalization. Meaning, whether it be China who's a threat or the US who's a threat, we're able to look at other partners like Southeast Asia, like India, and any other nation who does have capacity to be able to serve those needs and not get locked into those particular individuals. We think that this particular thing allows us to be able to also deal with things like inflation, wherein we're able to essentially spend less and redirect that particular aid towards developing things most proximate: public transportation, education, and healthcare. And for all of these reasons, we're able to actually build a better world at the point in which this economic ideology is able to flourish and the invisible hand is able to help itself. We are very proud to stand on side opposition.